on the 7th of December, 1941, the United States held roughly 530,000 long tons of rubber in strategic reserve. It sounded like a great deal. It was not. It was, by wartime planners' own later admission, barely enough to keep the American economy and the American military running for about a year at peacetime consumption. And peacetime consumption was about to become irrelevant. British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies supplied roughly 90% of the rubber the United States imported. Singapore fell within 10 weeks of Pearl Harbor on February 15, 1942. The Dutch East Indies followed 3 weeks later, surrendering on March 8. From that spring forward, the United States had almost no path to the one raw material that every tank, every truck, every bomber, and every gas mask in the American arsenal depended on to move. Not steel, not oil, rubber. Each American serviceman required roughly 32 pounds of rubber just in footwear, clothing, and equipment before a single tire or gasket was counted. And America had, in real terms, almost none coming in. This is the story of what the United States built instead, in about 2 years, essentially from a standing start. It is also the story of the country that had already gone further than anyone else toward solving this exact problem, and still, in the end, lost the race that mattered. Germany pioneered industrial-scale synthetic rubber production. Germany had been producing it industrially since 1937, 5 years before the American crash program even began, and the underlying research went back further still. And by 1944, the United States was outproducing the country that first industrialized Buna rubber by a wide margin, at minimum 6 times over. This is the story of how that happened, and why the flat, undramatic language of the post-war survey that measured the gap says more than any speech could. Start with Germany, because Germany really did get there first. In March of 1937, at a chemical works in Schkopau, in central Germany, the firm IG Farben brought online the world's first industrial-scale plant, producing what the Germans called Buna, a synthetic rubber built from butadiene and, later, styrene. Farben had begun developing the underlying chemistry more than a decade earlier, in the late 1920s, well before Hitler came to power, and synthetic rubber research itself was older still, going back to experiments in the 19th century. What Farben achieved first was not the idea of synthetic rubber, but the industrial process to make it at scale. A country planning a war of rapid armored movement across a continent with no colonial rubber plantations of its own could not risk depending on imported latex from Malaya and Brazil. Schkopau's first contract, signed in 1937, set capacity at 30,000 tons a year. A 1938 revision raised that to 60,000. A second plant, known as Buna II, went up at Hewells and began production in August of 1940. A third followed at the BASF works in Ludwigshafen in 1942. By 1944, Farben's own internal figures show that only 2% of the rubber consumed inside Germany was natural. The rest was Buna. On paper, Germany had gone further than any other country toward solving the very problem the United States was about to discover it had no answer for. There was a fourth Buna plant planned, meant to be the largest of them all, sited deliberately in occupied Poland, far enough east to sit beyond the range of British bombers, close to coal, lime, and salt, and close to a railway junction near a town called Oswiecim. Construction began in 1941. The site is better known to the world by its German name. It sat directly beside the Auschwitz concentration camp, and Farben built it using the forced labor of prisoners held at the adjoining camp the company itself commissioned, known as Auschwitz III or Monowitz. It is one of the grimmest chapters in the industrial history of the war, and it is also, in strictly technical terms, a failure. The Monowitz Buna Works was still under construction when the Red Army reached it in January of 1945. It never produced a single ton of finished rubber. It is the clearest evidence of how far German industrial capacity had actually fallen behind its own targets by the last years of the war. No matter how far ahead of the Americans that industry had once been, even counting every plant that did work, Germany's entire synthetic rubber industry by the peak years of 1943 and 1944 consisted of 5 factories with a combined rated capacity of about 175,000 tons a year. In practice, according to a 1945 American post-war technical survey of the German chemical industry, actual German output never reached 120,000 tons in either of those years. The same survey put a number on the American side of the comparison, roughly 209,000 tons in 1943 and about 737,000 tons in 1944. That is the entire German war machine's synthetic rubber supply from the country that had pioneered the process, measured against what the United States built, starting from almost nothing. At the start of 1942, American synthetic rubber production was not a national industry. It was 4 separate pilot plants, one apiece belonging to the 4 major tire manufacturers: Goodyear, Goodrich, Firestone, and United States Rubber, each experimenting independently, each holding its own patents close, none of them coordinated with the others or with the government. The entire country's synthetic output in 1941 was about 8,000 long tons. That was, essentially, America's entire synthetic rubber industry on the day Singapore fell. President Roosevelt understood by the summer of 1942 that this was no longer a rubber shortage. It was an emergency that could end the war before American industry ever got the chance to fight it. In August of 1942, he appointed a committee to investigate, led by the financier and presidential advisor Bernard Baruch, joined by James Conant, the president of Harvard, and Carl Compton, the president of MIT. Their report, delivered on September 10, 1942, did not equivocate. It raised the country's synthetic rubber production target from 705,000 tons to 845,000 tons a year, more than 100 times the country's entire 1941 output, though that goal itself would be revised up and down repeatedly over the following year, as war planners fought over which programs got scarce materials first. The report called for a single rubber director with complete authority over the supply and use of rubber, and for the construction of 51 new plants. Roosevelt appointed William Jeffers, the president of the Union Pacific Railroad, to the post that September. The press nicknamed him the Rubber Czar. 10 days into the job, Jeffers ordered gasoline rationing extended nationwide and imposed a 35-mile-an-hour national speed limit, which newspapers of the day called the victory speed. The government did not simply fund 4 private companies to expand their pilot plants. It built and owned the plants itself under a government-owned program and contracted the rubber companies, along with major oil and chemical firms that had never made rubber in their lives, to operate them. The patent-sharing fight that had kept the 4 original companies from cooperating was ended by government order on December 19, 1941, when Standard Oil of New Jersey, Firestone, Goodrich, Goodyear, and United States Rubber were compelled to sign an agreement, pooling their patents and their know-how. 11 university research groups were pulled into the effort almost overnight. Chemists from the University of Illinois, the University of Minnesota, and the University of Chicago working alongside industrial engineers to solve the specific chemistry of mass-producing a synthetic polymer that had, until months earlier, existed mostly in laboratory quantities. The first plants came online with a speed that startled the men who had spent the 1930s insisting the process could not be rushed. Firestone produced the American program's first bale of general-purpose synthetic rubber, called GRS, on April 26, 1942. Goodyear followed on May 18, United States Rubber on September 4, Goodrich on November 27. 4 plants running within the first year of the emergency. That was only the beginning. 15 plants were operating by 1943, and the government-owned system would eventually grow to the 51 plants Baruch's committee had called for. Production climbed in a curve that had no precedent in American industrial history, from about 8,000 tons in 1941 to roughly 209,000 tons in 1943, to about 737,000 tons in 1944. By 1945, American synthetic rubber production reached about 920,000 tons a year, and 85% of it was the general-purpose GRS compound that kept every Jeep, truck, and bomber tire in the American Armed Forces rolling. Put the two national efforts side by side, and the comparison stops being close. Germany, with a 5-year head start in actual production and more than a decade of research behind it, produced at most 120,000 tons of synthetic rubber in its best wartime year, out of 5 working plants, with a 6th never finished. The United States, starting from 8,000 tons and 4 disconnected pilot facilities in 1941, was producing more than 6 times that much, only 2 or 3 years later, out of a government-built system that grew to 51 plants. The American post-war survey team that inspected the German synthetic rubber industry after the surrender put the comparison in a single flat sentence, without embellishment. The same clipped, just the facts tone historians reach for when they're cataloging captured enemy equipment. The full rated capacity of the German plants, the survey noted, was never actually attained, and neither in 1943 nor 1944, the 2 years that mattered most, did total German output reach 120,000 tons. None of this stayed inside a laboratory or a War Production Board memo, and that is the part of the story that belongs alongside the donut trucks and the fuel dumps, because it shows the same pattern from a different direction. The synthetic rubber emergency reached directly into American households. Citizens were asked to turn in old tires, garden hoses, rubber shoes, bathing caps, anything made of rubber that was not currently in use, in a nationwide scrap drive in the summer of 1942. It fell well short of its goal, collecting a few 100,000 tons against a target of 1 million, and much of what came in was too degraded to be reused. But it was one of the first moments the American public understood that the war could be lost, or won on something as unglamorous as what was sitting in the garage. New tires for private cars effectively disappeared from the market, reserved for military and designated essential civilian use. Gasoline rationing on the East Coast had begun in May of 1942, driven partly by a genuine tanker shortage after Roosevelt diverted oil ships to Britain. But when rationing was extended to the entire country that December, the government said so plainly at the time. The limitation on gasoline was not about a shortage of gasoline at all. It was, in the government's own words, wholly a measure of rubber saving. The 35-mile-an-hour victory speed limit that came with it existed for the same reason, calculated tire tread by tire tread. What the American synthetic rubber program proves, in the end, is not that Germany's chemistry was inferior. It was not. Farben's scientists had built something genuinely ahead of its time, and American engineers spent the early months of the crash program learning from processes the Germans had already worked out years earlier. What decided the outcome was not who understood the chemistry first. It was who could turn a laboratory process into dozens of working factories, coordinated under one authority, staffed by companies that had been forced to share their patents instead of guard them, backed by a government willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars before it fully understood how the money would be used. Germany had gotten there first and could not scale it fast enough to matter. The plant that was supposed to close the gap, the one built at Auschwitz specifically to solve Germany's rubber shortfall once and for all, never produced a single ton because it was still standing half-finished when the war that was supposed to justify it had already been decided elsewhere. If a story like this is worth your time, a like helps it find people who want the real record instead of the highlight reel. If someone in your family remembers turning in tires or garden hoses for the scrap rubber drives, or remembers driving at 35 during the war years, I would be glad to read about it in the comments. Subscribe if you want the next one. There are more stories like this waiting in the parts of the war nobody put on a recruiting poster.